Hello everyone, welcome to Nightmare Chronicles. If you're enjoying the story, drop a like and hit subscribe button. Your support really motivates me to create more videos like this. It happened one summer evening when I was called to a friend's home for an urgent favor. Emily's younger brother, Oliver, had been acting strangely, and no one could figure out what was wrong with him. He'd always been a quiet kid, but lately, he'd become withdrawn, barely eating, and muttering strange words under his breath. His eyes seemed to follow something invisible around the room, and his face was twisted into a grin that looked unnatural, like something was forcing his expression. Desperate, Emily's family had brought in a local priest, Father Gregory, who believed Oliver was possessed by a malevolent spirit. Though skeptical, I stayed to support Emily, watching as the priest began to pray. The room felt heavy, as if something unseen was pushing down on us. Shadows seemed to flicker in the corners, and I could swear they were watching us, moving closer each time I glanced away. Oliver's voice turned guttural, mocking us, calling us by names we'd never revealed to him. At one point, he looked directly at me and started laughing, a laugh so low and menacing that it echoed in my head, chilling me to my core. Father Gregory's chants grew louder, his voice trembling slightly, but his determination unwavering. Oliver's grin stretched wider, unnatural, almost ripping at his face as he writhed and cursed, his small body convulsing as if it was being pulled in multiple directions. The candles in the room began to flicker wildly, and the air turned icy. I could feel my breath fogging up in the dim light, and a sickening smell filled the room. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, Oliver let out a blood-curdling scream, and his body went limp, falling silent. The shadows seemed to retreat, fading slowly as the room grew lighter, warmer. Oliver's eyes fluttered open, his usual innocent gaze returning, though he looked exhausted and pale. As we embraced him, relieved, Father Gregory whispered, "These things don't leave easily. They may lie dormant, but they're never gone." To this day, every time I catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye or hear a low chuckle in the silence, I remember that chilling grin and wonder if it ever really left us. It was the summer of 1998 when I first encountered the curse of St. Lucia, a hidden village nestled deep within the Italian countryside, shrouded in ancient superstition. I'd been sent there by my university to document the town's relics, but the locals warned me against visiting the old abbey, which they claimed was cursed. My curiosity, however, got the better of me, and on the third night I ventured out alone under a pale, ghostly moon, flashlight in hand. The path to the abbey was twisted, shrouded in fog, with shadows dancing as though alive. As I entered the crumbling building, a chill ran down my spine. The air was dense, heavy with the stench of mold and something else, something far more sinister. I heard soft whispers, unintelligible yet chilling, echoing through the vast, dark hall. Brushing off my fear, I began exploring, but soon felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like invisible eyes watching my every move. In the center of the abbey, I found a dusty, ancient altar, and as I reached out to touch it, a sudden cold gripped my wrist. I froze, heart racing, and then I heard a voice, a guttural, unearthly moan that echoed through the chamber, whispering my name. Terrified, I stumbled back, but it was too late. The door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I spent what felt like hours pounding on the door, desperate to escape, until finally it swung open on its own. I bolted out, never looking back, but the curse had already taken hold. I returned to the village, only to find everyone staring at me with horror. They whispered that I had the mark now, the price for disturbing the abbey. For years afterward, I was haunted by strange occurrences. Flickering lights, eerie whispers in the dead of night, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Every night, I saw a shadowy figure in my dreams, a dark presence lurking just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for the moment to claim me. The locals said I was marked by St. Lucia's curse, a punishment that, once bestowed, could never be undone. I never believed in curses until the night I saw one take root before my very eyes. It all began when my friend David, a usually sensible and mild-mannered man, returned from an archaeological dig in Eastern Europe with a strange artifact. A small stone amulet, carved with unsettling symbols that seemed to squirm when you looked directly at them. He showed it to me with excitement, claiming it was from a site linked to ancient occult rituals. But that night, he mentioned something strange. He felt watched, as if eyes lurked in the shadows around him. At first, I thought he was just spooked by stories, but when he began to experience intense nightmares and eventually disturbing hallucinations, I began to worry. David grew paranoid, convinced that something from the dig had followed him back, something dark. His health deteriorated, and he seemed to lose himself piece by piece, both physically and mentally. One night, he showed up at my doorstep in a state of terror, barely able to speak. Between panicked breaths, he muttered about the mark of shadows, claiming it was an ancient curse and that he had accidentally bound himself to it. He insisted that the curse wasn't just after him, it was starting to reach anyone close to him. I was skeptical. But then David rolled up his sleeve to reveal his forearm covered in dark, spidery symbols. The same strange patterns I'd seen on the amulet, now burned into his skin. I felt a chill run down my spine, but he begged me not to look away. He told me how the amulet was meant to seal away something ancient and malevolent, and by removing it from its resting place, he had unleashed that dark presence. Over the next few days, David's condition worsened. He was plagued by violent visions, voices whispering incomprehensible words in his ear, and shadows moving across his walls even in the dead of night. Each day, he looked more gaunt and hollow, as though something was draining him of life. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a professor specializing in occult studies, and he agreed to meet with us after I explained David's plight. The professor, a grizzled man with a grim expression, inspected the amulet and grew visibly disturbed, warning that this was no ordinary artifact. It was a vessel of entrapment meant to bind a malevolent entity. He explained that the Mark of Shadows was a curse bound to the soul of anyone who touched it, linking them to the spirit it was meant to contain. The professor believed that the only way to sever the connection was to perform a ritual of banishment. But the danger was high. If we failed, it would strengthen the bond between David and the spirit, marking him forever. We had no choice, and so on a stormy night, we gathered in a clearing deep within the woods outside of town. The ritual began with chanting, candles flickering in the wind as thunder rumbled overhead. David stood in the center, the amulet gripped tightly in his hand. The professor poured salt in a circle around him, muttering incantations to ward off any interference. But as the ritual progressed, the air grew thick and a dark, chilling energy filled the space. Shadows began to writhe within the trees, twisting and stretching like sentient things, creeping ever closer. Suddenly, David let out a guttural scream, his eyes rolling back as his body convulsed. The professor shouted for me to stay focused, warning that the spirit was fighting back, unwilling to release its hold. I watched helplessly as the symbols on David's arm began to glow a sickly green, pulsing in time with his labored breathing. He collapsed to his knees, clawing at his own skin as though trying to tear the curse off his flesh. Then, the professor produced a vial of sacred water, pouring it over the amulet while chanting in a language I couldn't understand. The ground trembled, and the air grew so cold that I could see my own breath. Shadows wreathed wildly, slithering closer, defying the salt barrier. Just as the professor's chant reached its climax, a figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, shadowy silhouette with piercing, malevolent eyes. The figure's presence was overwhelming, filling me with a primal dread that left me rooted in place, unable to move or even breathe. The professor's voice wavered, but he continued, screaming the final words of the ritual as the shadow advanced. In a desperate last effort, David, barely conscious, gripped the amulet and thrust it forward, as though offering it back. The spirit let out a shriek, a piercing wail that echoed through the forest as the shadowy figure lunged toward David, only to be halted by an unseen force. A blinding light erupted from the amulet, casting the entire clearing in an eerie, unnatural glow. The spirit writhed, its form dissolving like smoke in the wind, shrieking as it was pulled back into the amulet. As the light dimmed, David collapsed, unconscious but seemingly free of the curse. The symbols on his arm faded to a faint outline before disappearing entirely. The professor let out a shaky breath, whispering a prayer of thanks, while I helped David up, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. But as we turned to leave, I noticed a faint, almost invisible mark on the professor's arm, the same dark pattern that had been on David's. He met my gaze, his face pale and resigned, and simply said, "Some things cannot be escaped, only transferred." A heavy silence fell between us, and in that moment, I realized the professor had sacrificed himself to save David. As we left the woods, I felt a lingering chill, as though the shadows were watching us, waiting. David recovered in the following days, his health slowly returning, but he was haunted by fragments of memories from that night. He would wake up screaming, clutching his arm, and sometimes in those quiet, sleepless nights, I still feel that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if the mark of shadows had never truly been banished. The amulet was buried, locked away, but the memory remains, and the mark, I fear, is still lurking, waiting for its next chance to find a host. It was supposed to be a routine check, something that barely crossed my mind until it became the most horrifying experience of my life. I had been called to an old manor on the outskirts of town, a crumbling relic with a history soaked in tragedy. The owners had reported strange occurrences, footsteps in the night, chilling whispers, and objects moving of their own accord. As a paranormal investigator, I'd encountered my share of eerie situations, but nothing prepared me for what I faced there. The moment I stepped inside, an oppressive atmosphere wrapped around me, a thick silence that seemed to vibrate with unseen energy. My equipment flickered erratically as I moved through the dust-laden rooms, each corner feeling darker and colder than the last. In the grand hall, I noticed something strange. A mirror, cracked and aged, with streaks that seemed to resemble claw marks. When I looked into it, I saw my reflection, but twisted, with sunken eyes and a smile that was not my own. A voice, deep and grating, hissed my name from nowhere, filling me with an instinctive terror that urged me to leave. But the family who lived there was desperate, and I couldn't abandon them. As I continued my investigation, things grew worse. Doors slammed on their own, strange symbols appeared on the walls, and the temperature dropped so drastically I could see my breath. Suddenly, an overwhelming pressure seized my chest, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air as an icy sensation slithered over my skin. I felt something, an unseen force, clawing its way into my mind, whispering vile, invasive thoughts that were not my own. I tried to stand, to flee, but my body felt paralyzed, trapped in a vice of fear and darkness. Finally, after what felt like hours, I managed to escape to the manor's chapel, the one place the entity seemed to avoid. There, I found a journal belonging to the original owner, a woman named Isabel, accused of witchcraft centuries ago, her spirit rumored to haunt the manor. As I read her desperate words of suffering and revenge, the temperature dropped again, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. Spinning around, I found myself face to face with a shadowy figure, its hollow eyes staring through me with a look of pure malice. It whispered that I was not welcome, that I would pay for intruding. Heart racing, I fled from the manor, stumbling into the early dawn light. Though I survived, I left a part of myself there, trapped in that shadowed hell, and even now, every reflection I glimpse shows the twisted smile of that creature, reminding me that I'll never truly escape its grasp. Millstone House had always given me the creeps. It was an old, decrepit mansion at the edge of our town, shrouded in legends of people going missing and strange, ghostly lights seen through its windows at night. I never thought I'd step foot inside, let alone witness what I did that fateful night. My friend Eric, an avid paranormal investigator, had convinced me and a few others to join him in documenting whatever we could find inside. "It's just an adventure," he'd said, laughing off my hesitation. Little did he know the horrors that awaited us. The moment we crossed the threshold, the atmosphere turned oppressive, and the air grew thick with a smell like rotting flesh. Shadows danced along the crumbling walls, seeming to twist and contort out of the corner of our eyes. As we moved through the labyrinthine halls, a chill seeped into our bones, and we heard faint whispers echoing from unseen corners, growing louder with each step. Suddenly, we found ourselves in a large candlelit room, its walls covered in ancient, indecipherable symbols. At its center was a broken, blood-stained chair, its leather worn and cracked, as if it had been witness to countless horrors. Eric seemed drawn to it, his face pale and eyes wide with a strange fascination. Before I could stop him, he sat down, a move he would soon regret. The temperature plummeted, and an invisible force seemed to take hold of him. His face twisted in agony, and his voice took on a guttural tone, muttering things in a language none of us recognized. We tried to pull him from the chair, but an unseen force flung us back, pinning us to the walls as Eric convulsed, his eyes rolling back into his head. I'd never felt so helpless, watching as my friend writhed, his body contorted in unnatural angles, while his laughter echoed, chilling and hollow. The room was alive, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to feed off our terror. Suddenly, Eric's eyes snapped open, but they weren't his eyes anymore. They were empty, black pits that stared right through us, devoid of any humanity. He spoke in a voice that wasn't his, taunting us, revealing secrets only we would know, probing our deepest fears. One by one, he called us by name, forcing us to listen to truths we'd buried long ago. Then, just as we thought it couldn't get worse, the walls began to bleed, a thick, dark ooze dripping from the cracks, pooling at our feet. Eric, or whatever was inside him, stood up, his movements jerky and inhuman, advancing towards us with a malevolent smile. We were frozen, paralyzed by a fear that gripped our souls. In a final desperate act, one of my friends managed to scream out a prayer, and the room trembled. Eric collapsed, the entity seemingly expelled, leaving him shivering on the floor, pale and gaunt. We didn't wait to find out if it was truly over. We grabbed him and fled the house, stumbling out into the cold night air, too shaken to speak. Eric never spoke of what happened in that chair, and to this day, he refuses to even acknowledge that night. But I know it left something dark in each of us. A lingering shadow that follows us in silence, a constant reminder that we should have left Millstone House alone. I'll never forget the night I went to see an exorcism. It was my sister Rachel, a girl who once radiated life and warmth, now reduced to a hollow shell of her former self. She'd been showing strange signs for weeks, sleepwalking, talking to people who weren't there, and having violent outbursts that no one could explain. We tried everything, visiting doctors, psychiatrists, even herbalists, but nothing worked. When my mother suggested calling Father Luis, a priest known for dealing with unholy cases, I resisted. I didn't believe in that sort of thing until I saw it with my own eyes. We brought Rachel to St. Brigid's, a crumbling old church hidden on the outskirts of town, where the air felt thick, like it held secrets. The chapel was dimly lit, with shadows playing tricks in the flickering candlelight as Father Louis prepared for the ritual. He had a weary, somber look about him, like a man who'd seen things he'd rather forget. Yet his voice held a quiet confidence as he warned us, "Whatever happens, don't interrupt." As he began the prayers, a chill ran through the room, and Rachel, who had been sitting still, suddenly thrashed in her chair, her face twisted in a way I'd never seen before. Her eyes opened, but they weren't her eyes. they were vacant, filled with a darkness that seemed to stare right through me. She hissed in a voice that wasn't hers, saying things that no one else could know, secrets buried so deep I felt naked under that gaze. She laughed, a sound that seemed to crawl up my spine, and mocked Father Louis, calling him by his first name, speaking of sins he'd confessed decades ago. Father Louis didn't waver, his prayers getting louder as he battled the evil force inhabiting my sister. I stood frozen, my heart pounding as Rachel's face contorted further, her skin growing pale as shadows seemed to seep into her very being. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, our breaths forming mist as we huddled in fear. Objects in the room started moving, small at first, a candle, a book, then heavier items, chairs scraping across the floor as if by some invisible force. Rachel's body writhed violently and her voice turned to pleading, begging me to help her, using a tone so familiar, so convincing that I almost stepped forward. But Father Louis shot me a warning glance, and I held back, clutching the crucifix he'd handed me earlier. She screamed, and I swear it wasn't her voice but something ancient, something that filled the room with an indescribable sense of dread. I could feel the evil radiating from her, pressing down on us, thick and suffocating. For hours, Father Louis fought against that dark presence, his voice unwavering even as his face grew pale and sweat trickled down his forehead. At one point, Rachel's head turned toward me, her eyes glowing with a malevolent fire as she sneered, "You'll never save her. She's mine." I wanted to scream, to run, but Father Louis continued, his words cutting through the darkness, until finally, with one last guttural scream, Rachel went limp, her body sagging in the chair. The temperature returned to normal, and the room was silent except for our ragged breathing. Father Louis, visibly drained, murmured, "It's over." We rushed to Rachel, who looked frail and exhausted, yet at peace for the first time in weeks. But even now, years later, I sometimes hear that voice in my nightmares, that mocking laugh, and I wonder if, just maybe, the devil isn't done with us yet.